Hey guys, tonight, let's drift far away, to a place where the air was thick with sand and incense, where the great river shimmered beneath an endless golden sky. Before we begin, I'm curious, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Maybe it's midnight, maybe early morning. Either way, close your eyes, and imagine the sound of water, slow and eternal, the quiet breath of the Nile. It's hard to imagine what life was like in ancient Egypt. We think of pyramids, pharaohs, and endless deserts. But behind the great monuments, there are people, farmers, builders, mothers, children, living their quiet lives beneath the same sun that still shines today. Our story begins with one of them. His name was Ammonius. Not the god, just a boy, born in a small village not far from the great city of Thebes. His house was made of clay bricks baked by the same sun that warmed his skin. The roof was flat, and sometimes on hot nights, he would climb up there to sleep beneath the stars. Ammonius' family wasn't rich, but they were proud. His father was a farmer, strong and quiet, with hands darkened by the soil of the riverbank. His mother weaved baskets and mats that she sold at the local market. Every morning, before the sun rose, Ammonius would wake to the distant songs of the ibis birds. The air would still be cool then, just before the heat began to rise like a living thing. The village smelled of wet earth and smoke from cooking fires. Children ran barefoot along narrow paths, chasing goats and laughing. In the distance, you could already see the shimmer of the river, the great Nile, lifeblood of all Egypt. Ammonius dreamed of more than the fields. He would sit near the water, watching boats glide by, some carrying reeds and grain, others loaded with goods from distant lands. He often wondered where they were going. He had never left his village, but he could feel that the world was bigger than the horizon of sand and palms. Sometimes he'd talk to the fishermen who passed by. They told him stories about temples rising high above the river, about pharaohs who ruled with the power of gods, about deserts filled with hidden tombs and treasures. He would listen, eyes wide, until the sun sank low and turned the water to liquid gold. But life in Egypt was not all beauty and wonder. The people depended entirely on the rhythm of the Nile. When it rose too high, it destroyed the crops. When it stayed too low, hunger crept into every home. The gods, they believed, controlled this balance, and so every prayer, every offering, was a quiet plea for mercy. That night, after a long day of helping his father in the fields, Ammonius sat outside, watching the fading light. He could hear the insects begin their endless chorus. His mother hummed a soft tune while grinding grain into flour. The smell of baking bread drifted through the warm air. And somewhere in the distance, drums echoed faintly from a nearby temple where priests prepared offerings for the coming festival of Ra, the sun god. Ammonius didn't know much about the rituals, but the sound filled him with wonder. What were the priests doing inside those walls, hidden from ordinary eyes? He didn't yet know that his path would one day lead him there, that the temple, with its towering columns and sacred silence, would become part of his life in ways he could never imagine. For now, he was just a boy beneath the stars, his thoughts floating down the river like lotus petals. The night was warm, the world ancient and alive, and the river whispered softly, as it had for thousands of years. And as he drifted into sleep, the voice of the Nile seemed to murmur to him, in a language older than time itself. All things change, but I remain. When the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, the air was cool and still. Ammonius opened his eyes to the faint hum of insects and the smell of damp earth. The sky above the Nile was painted in soft shades of rose and gold, and the surface of the river shimmered like glass. It was the moment before Egypt awoke. Quiet, eternal, sacred. The Nile was everything. Without it, there would be no life, no harvest, no Egypt at all. The people called it Itaru, the great river, and believed it was born from the tears of the goddess Isis. Every season, It rose and fell with perfect rhythm, flooding the farmlands and leaving behind dark, rich soil, the gift of the river, they said. Ammonius walked barefoot toward the banks, feeling the cool mud between his toes. Around him, farmers were already at work, their voices low and steady. Some led oxen through the fields, dragging wooden plows. Others carried baskets of seeds, tossing them gently into the soft ground. The sun had barely risen, and yet sweat already glistened on their skin. He watched his father, shoulders broad and strong, guiding a pair of oxen through a shallow patch of soil. The rhythm of the work was slow but steady, the same rhythm that had carried generations before him. The fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and above them, white ibises circled like living symbols of the gods. Sometimes Ammonius helped, though he preferred to watch. He liked to listen to the farmers talk as they worked, their conversations drifting between prayers and laughter. One man told of a crocodile he saw near the marshes. Another swore that last night, he heard the goddess Happy herself whispering through the reeds. After a few hours, when the sun began to blaze, Ammonius carried a basket of reeds down to the water. His task was simple: to gather small fish and fill jars with cool river water for the family. The fishermen waved to him as he approached. Their boats were narrow and made of papyrus, light enough to lift with 2 hands. Nets hung over the sides, glistening in the sunlight. One of them, an older man named Dedu, smiled at Ammonius. "You watch the water too much, boy," he said. "Careful, or it will start watching you back." Ammonius laughed, unsure if it was a joke or a warning. Dedu was known for his stories, tales of spirits that lived beneath the river, glowing fish that appeared only under the full moon, and lost cities buried deep beneath the silt. Some said he'd seen them himself. "Is it true?" Ammonius asked. "Are there spirits in the Nile?" Dedu shrugged, his weathered face unreadable. "There are spirits everywhere, my boy. Some kind, some cruel. But the Nile remembers everything. Every word, every secret, every offering ever made. That's why we respect it." The old man cast his net into the water with practiced grace, and Ammonius watched as silver fish flashed beneath the surface. For a long moment, the boy stood silently, listening to the rippling sound of the river. It was calm, but it carried the weight of eternity. Later that afternoon, the village came alive again. Women washed linen in the shallows, laughing as they worked. Children splashed nearby, their laughter echoing across the banks. Traders pushed small boats filled with goods, jars of honey, onions, papyrus rolls, and called out to passers-by. Life pulsed along the water like blood through a vein. When Ammonius' father returned from the fields, his face was streaked with dust. "The river's good to us this year," he said, kneeling to rinse his hands. "If the floods come on time, we'll have enough grain to trade." The family gathered to eat beneath the shade of a fig tree. Flatbread, dates, and small roasted fish. Simple food, but enough. Ammonius listened as his parents talked about the harvest, taxes, and the coming festival in Thebes. He didn't say much. His mind wandered with the river, imagining what lay beyond the bend where the water disappeared into the haze. That night, as the stars returned, Ammonius sat alone by the bank. The moonlight painted the river silver, and he could hear frogs croaking in the reeds. Somewhere out there, priests in faraway temples were watching the same moon, perhaps whispering the same prayers. He picked up a handful of wet soil and let it fall slowly through his fingers. It was dark, fertile, alive. This was the heart of Egypt, the reason cities rose, temples stood, and people dreamed. The river gave everything, and someday, it would take everything back. Ammonius didn't know it yet, but the Nile's rhythm would soon pull him into a journey far greater than he could imagine. One that would lead him from the quiet banks of his village to the towering gates of temples, and into the secrets of gods themselves. For now, though, he sat in silence, listening to the endless whisper of the river, the voice of time itself. The first thing Ammonius heard was the sound of his mother's grinding stone. It was steady and soft, a rhythm that belonged to the dawn. The smell of baking bread filled their small clay house, and through the open doorway, the light of the rising sun spilled across the floor in long golden lines. The air was cool for now, but everyone knew it would not stay that way for long. He rose quietly, brushing sand from his hair. Their home was simple: one room, a few baskets, a clay water jar, and a low bed made of woven reeds. Against the wall stood a small wooden statue of Taurit, the goddess who protected families. His mother always touched it gently each morning, whispering a prayer before the day began. Outside, the village was waking. Roosters crowed. The cries of donkeys echoed between the mud brick walls. Women carried jars of water from the river, balancing them gracefully on their heads. The sun climbed higher, bathing the fields in light so bright it made Ammonius squint. His father was already gone, working the fields. Ammonius' task today was to help the potter, a friend of his uncle, who shaped clay into jars and bowls for the nearby temple. It wasn't exciting work, but it meant Ammonius could learn, and perhaps someday, earn enough to travel to Thebes. He ate quickly, a small piece of flatbread, some figs, and cool water. Then he set off through the dusty paths, greeting neighbors as he passed. He knew everyone in the village: the old woman who sold papyrus sandals, the boys who tended goats, and the scribe who, once a week, came from the city to collect grain taxes. The scribe fascinated Ammonius. He seemed to carry the knowledge of 100 men in his reed pens and ink jars. The potter's workshop was near the edge of the village, close to the kiln that always smoked faintly. The air smelled of wet earth and ash. "Ah, Ammonius," the potter said, smiling through streaks of clay on his arms. "Today, you'll learn to make a jar worthy of the gods." The wheel spun slowly, and Ammonius watched as the man's hands shaped the lump of clay into something beautiful. Smooth, perfect, symmetrical, it was as if the jar grew from the potter's fingertips like a living thing. When Ammonius tried, his first attempt collapsed into a crooked shape, and the potter only laughed. "Patience, boy. Even the pyramids began as dust." They worked until the heat became heavy and the smell of baked clay filled the air. From the open door, Ammonius could see the shimmer of the Nile in the distance, and small boats gliding past, their sails bright against the blue. When noon came, he walked back toward the village square. There, a group of children gathered around an old man, the storyteller. His voice carried through the air like music. "Once," the man said, "the god Ra sailed across the sky each day in his golden boat. But when night came, he had to battle the serpent of darkness, Apophis, to bring back the light." Ammonius sat in the shade, listening, his imagination filled with gods, monsters, and stars. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were the way people made sense of the world, the reason the sun rose, and the Nile flowed. Later, he returned home. His mother was washing linen near the river, singing softly. "How was your day?" she asked. "Did you learn?" "I tried," Ammonius said, smiling. "But the clay didn't listen to me." She laughed. "Then maybe tomorrow it will. Nothing in this world comes easily, not even talking to clay." As the afternoon passed, shadows grew long and golden. The heat faded. The villagers gathered together, sharing bread, dates, and stories. Ammonius sat near the fire, his skin warm from the glow, watching sparks rise into the night. He thought about the potter's words, about patience, and how even pyramids began as dust. Maybe his life, too, would start small and rise slowly, stone by stone, dream by dream. Above him, the stars appeared one by one, ancient and bright, watching silently over the land that had seen countless mornings like this one. The Nile murmured somewhere beyond the fields, and the scent of bread, clay, and fire lingered in the air. Ammonius closed his eyes, letting the night settle around him like a blanket. Tomorrow would come, and with it, new work, new lessons, and perhaps a new story. But for now, the world was quiet, timeless, like the gods themselves. The morning was brighter than usual, and a low hum of excitement spread through the village. A small group of priests had arrived from the nearby temple of Ammonius Ra, their linen robes spotless, their heads shaved smooth. They came to collect offerings for the upcoming festival of the sun. The sight of them stirred something deep in Ammonius, awe, curiosity, maybe even longing. For as long as he could remember, the temple had been a mystery. It stood far beyond the fields, its white walls gleaming like polished bone against the sky. He had seen it only from a distance, a place forbidden to ordinary villagers unless summoned for service or offering. His father said it was the home of the gods themselves. That day, Ammonius followed the priests as they walked back toward the river. He stayed a few paces behind, careful not to be noticed. They carried baskets filled with grain, fruit, and small clay figurines, offerings from the people. The priests' movements were slow and graceful, almost like a dance. They spoke softly, their voices blending with the murmur of the wind and the call of birds along the water. When they reached the temple grounds, Ammonius stopped at the gates. Two massive statues stood before him, towering stone figures of lions with human faces. Their eyes seemed alive, watching. Beyond them rose the temple itself, columns carved with stories of gods and kings, painted in deep reds and golds that shimmered in the sunlight. The air smelled of incense and oil. A guard stood nearby, but he didn't stop the boy. Perhaps he saw the wonder in Ammonius' eyes and felt pity. Or perhaps, as some believed, the gods themselves invited those meant to enter. Inside, the temperature changed instantly. The air was cool and still, heavy with the scent of myrrh. Shadows flickered across the walls from torches that burned low. Every step echoed softly through the stone hall. Hieroglyphs covered every surface, stories of creation, of the sun god Ra sailing through the sky, of Osiris ruling the world beyond. A priest passed by, holding a bronze bowl filled with smoke. His expression was serene, distant. Ammonius felt small, almost invisible, yet deeply alive. The sound of chanting drifted from deeper inside the temple, rhythmic and low, like the heartbeat of the world. He followed the sound until he reached a large open chamber. In its center stood a golden statue of Ammonius Ra, radiant even in the dim light. The priests surrounded it, moving in perfect harmony, their voices rising in waves. Ra, great lord of the sun, giver of life and light, we honor your rising, we honor your fire. Ammonius watched, frozen in wonder. The statue's eyes seemed to glint in the flickering firelight, as if the god himself was looking directly at him. For a brief, impossible moment, he felt the warmth of the sun not above him, but inside him, a pulse of energy calm and powerful. He wanted to stay forever, but one of the older priests noticed him and slowly approached. His voice was neither harsh nor kind, only steady. "You are not meant to be here, child," he said. "The temple is sacred ground." Ammonius lowered his head. "I'm sorry. I only wanted to see." The priest studied him for a long time, then nodded slightly. "Then see. But remember, what you have seen is not for eyes alone. The gods do not reveal themselves without purpose." He gently guided Ammonius toward the exit. As the boy stepped back into the sunlight, his heart still pounded with awe. The noise of the outside world felt distant, the calls of traders, the cries of birds, even the rush of the wind. Everything seemed smaller now. On his way home, Ammonius couldn't shake the feeling that something within him had changed. He had seen more than a building. He had felt something, the presence of something vast and old, beyond understanding. That night, as he lay under the open sky, he stared at the stars that glittered like tiny fires over the desert. He thought of the golden statue, the chanting, and the words of the priest. The gods do not reveal themselves without purpose. What purpose could a simple boy like him have? He didn't know. But deep inside he felt it, like the steady current of the Nile beneath the moonlight, a calling he could neither explain nor ignore. The air shimmered with heat, and the entire village buzzed with life. It was the day of the Festival of the Sun, a day when even the hardest workers left their tools, when songs replaced the usual rhythm of plows and hammers. For weeks, people had prepared offerings, polished jewelry, and dyed their linen garments bright with ochre and indigo. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Ammonius woke early, his heart already pounding. Outside, he could hear the sound of drums echoing faintly from across the river. His mother was braiding her hair and humming an old song about the journey of Ra across the sky. She smiled when she saw him. "Today," she said, "even the gods will stop to listen." By the time they reached the center of the village, the celebration had already begun. Stalls lined the dusty square, jars of honey, roasted grain, garlands of lotus flowers, and cups filled with sweet palm wine. The smell of incense drifted through the air, mixing with the scent of sweat and sun-warmed earth. Musicians played flutes and drums, their rhythm weaving through the crowd like a heartbeat. In the center stood an altar made of polished stone. Atop it rested a small golden disc representing the sun, a symbol of Ra himself. When the priests arrived, the crowd fell into silence. They wore white robes trimmed with gold and carried long staffs shaped like serpents and falcons. One by one, they placed offerings before the altar: baskets of grain, jars of milk, fresh fish, flowers gathered from the banks of the Nile. Ammonius stood on the edge of the crowd, his eyes wide. The priests began to chant, their voices rising in deep unison. The sound was ancient, steady, and filled the air with a strange kind of power. As the chanting grew louder, the people raised their hands to the sky, greeting the blazing sun. The light reflected off bracelets, necklaces, and golden amulets until it seemed the entire crowd shimmered. Then came the dancers, young women draped in linen, their bodies painted with faint lines of gold dust. They moved slowly at first, circling the altar, their movements graceful like the flow of the river. The rhythm quickened, and the crowd clapped along, cheering as the dancers spun faster, their jewelry flashing in the sunlight. Ammonius felt his chest tighten. For the first time, he didn't feel like a spectator. He felt connected to the people, the earth, the river, the sky. The music wasn't just sound, it was life itself. Every beat seemed to echo through his bones, through the soil beneath his feet, through the centuries of Egypt's endless story. The priest lifted a small golden bowl and poured oil onto the altar. The flames leapt high, bright and wild. A collective gasp ran through the crowd as the fire roared toward the sky, glowing so intensely it was almost white. The priest's voice thundered above the drums. "Ra, giver of light, we honor you. Shine upon us, and bless our fields, our homes, and our hearts." The crowd repeated his words in one voice, their shouts rolling through the air like waves. Birds startled from the trees, flying up into the blazing blue sky. As the music slowed and the chanting faded, the celebration turned to joy. People laughed, shared food, and danced in small circles. Children ran through the crowd with garlands of flowers, and old men clapped to the rhythm of the drums. Ammonius' father even smiled, something that rarely happened outside of harvest season. When evening came, the color of the sky turned deep amber, and the priests carried torches to the riverbank. The people followed, still humming softly. One by one, they placed small clay lamps into the water, each flame flickering gently as it drifted downstream. The sight was breathtaking, hundreds of tiny lights floating across the surface of the Nile, their reflections trembling like stars in motion. Ammonius knelt by the water, watching the lamps disappear into the distance. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder. "Each one carries a prayer," she whispered. "Maybe the gods will hear yours too." He didn't answer. He only nodded and looked deeper into the water, his reflection shimmering between light and shadow. Somewhere beyond the flickering lamps and endless current, he thought he saw something, or maybe someone, watching him from the depths. A shape, faint and golden, that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The drums grew softer. The crowd began to disperse. But Ammonius remained there by the river long after the last light faded. The air was cool now, the sand cold beneath his feet. He felt the presence of something vast and invisible, the same feeling he had inside the temple, but stronger, closer. The same sun that had blazed all day now slept beneath the horizon, and in the silence of the night, the Nile whispered to him again. It spoke of journeys, of destinies carried like boats on the river's back. And though he could not yet understand its meaning, Ammonius felt the truth of it deep within him. His life was beginning to flow towards something greater. The Nile was everything. It wasn't just a river, it was the heartbeat of Egypt. Without it, there would have been no life here, only endless sand and silence. Every morning, before the sun fully rose, I would hear the faint rustle of reeds along the water's edge, the croak of frogs, and the soft splash of fishermen casting their nets. The air would still be cool, heavy with mist, and the smell of wet earth mixed with the scent of lotus flowers. Our fields stretched along the riverbanks, rich and black with silt from the yearly flood. We called that season Ake, the time of inundation, when the Nile rose from the southern lands, swelling and spreading like a living creature, covering the fields in water. My father used to say the flood was both a blessing and a warning. Too little water meant hunger. Too much could wash away entire villages. When the floods receded, the land turned green almost overnight. Barley, emmer wheat, flax, they all grew quickly under the golden sun. We worked from dawn until the sky began to glow orange and the desert winds returned. The rhythm of the river shaped everything. When we planted, when we harvested, when we rested. Even our gods followed its pulse. Happy, the god of the flood, was painted on our walls as a plump, cheerful figure with water plants on his head. People left offerings by the shore, bread, fish, flowers, whispering prayers for gentle waters. Sometimes I thought I could hear Happy's laughter in the waves when the river sparkled at noon. But at night, when crocodiles slid silently through the water, and the moon shone silver on their eyes, the river felt different, darker, mysterious, alive in another way. There were stories about spirits that lived beneath the surface. Some said that when the flood came too early, it was because the river was angry. Others believed that drowned souls drifted forever below, whispering to the current. I remember one evening, sitting near the water with my friend Nebbit, when we saw something move, just a ripple, but it carried a faint, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. We looked at each other, but said nothing. Some things in Egypt were better left unspoken. Every year, before the flood, priests would take sacred vessels filled with offerings and cast them into the river. They said it was to honor the gods and ensure the return of life. Watching them, I felt a strange connection, as if the same water that had touched the temples of the gods also touched my feet, my home, my life. And it was true. The Nile connected everything, from the stone quarries far in the south, where men carved blocks for temples, to the great delta where papyrus boats floated toward the sea. Travelers, merchants, priests, and farmers all followed the same current. The river was our road, our food, our God. But I also learned the river could take what it gave. One summer, when the floods came too late, the earth cracked and turned pale. People looked at the sky, praying for clouds that never came. Then the next year, the Nile rose too high, villages drowned, and we rebuilt from the mud. Life along the Nile was a delicate balance between gratitude and fear. Even now, when I think back to those shimmering days by the river, I remember the hum of insects, the laughter of workers, and the distant chants from temples. The Nile was not just a river, it was time itself, flowing endlessly, carrying our hopes, our harvests, and our memories into eternity. As the years passed, I began to understand that everything in Egypt, every field, every prayer, every song, led back to one great truth: the desire to be remembered forever. That was the heart of our world. The Nile gave us life, but the monuments we built were meant to defy death itself. I still remember the first time I saw the pyramids of Giza. I was a boy, traveling with a group of traders delivering grain to Memphis. When the sandstorm lifted, they appeared in the distance like mountains made by gods. The sun struck their golden caps, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. They didn't seem real. They looked as if they had always existed, like the horizon itself. Men said that tens of thousands of workers built them: farmers, craftsmen, stonecutters, slaves, and free men alike. But in truth, no one really knew. Some claimed that the stones moved by magic. Others whispered that the pharaoh had commanded the gods to lend their strength. The workers' city nearby was filled with noise: hammers on stone, laughter around fires, the rhythm of drums guiding men as they pulled massive blocks on sledges greased with water. The overseers shouted from the scaffolds, their voices hoarse in the heat. And yet, there was something holy about that labor. The people believed that by building for the pharaoh, they were also building a piece of their own eternity. Each stone, each carved sign, was a prayer in stone, a promise that Egypt would never fade. When the sun was at its highest, the workers would rest beneath strips of linen stretched for shade. They shared bread made from barley and dried dates, and some poured cool beer from clay jars. Beer, thick, sweet, and grainy, was our comfort and our strength. Even priests drank it, claiming it was a gift from the gods. I often wonder if the taste of that beer, simple, ancient, has survived across the centuries. By night, the desert cooled, and the stars came alive. The same constellations we knew, Orion, which we called Sa, still watched over us. The priests said that the pharaoh's soul would rise to those stars when his body slept beneath the pyramid. Sometimes I'd lie on the sand and imagine him sailing through the sky on a golden boat, gliding past the gods, his name forever written in light. Inside the temples, the air smelled of incense and myrrh. The walls were alive with carvings, rows of men offering gifts, gods with animal heads, birds in flight. The hieroglyphs seemed to breathe when the torchlight flickered over them. Every symbol told a story, every figure held meaning. I began to see how the Egyptians wrote not just with words, but with life itself, with water, air, stars, and stone. But behind the glory of the monuments was the quiet suffering of those who built them. I met a man named Katie, a stonemason who had worked for 20 years on the same wall. His hands were rough as sandstone, his eyes pale from dust. Yet when he spoke of his work, he smiled. "The stone remembers," he said. "Long after we are gone, it will still speak." And he was right. Even now I can almost hear it, the low hum of chisels, the steady rhythm of creation. The sound of a people building not just for kings, but for eternity itself. Life in Egypt was not only the rhythm of the river or the grandeur of monuments. It was also the whisper of secrets hidden beneath the endless sand. As I grew older, I began to wander beyond our village, past the fields and the reeds, into the open desert that stretched like a golden ocean. There the wind shifted constantly, uncovering fragments of lives long gone. One afternoon, I found an unusual stone half buried in the sand. It was smooth and dark, shaped by human hands, carved with symbols I did not yet understand. Curiosity pulled me closer. I brushed away the grains, revealing lines that resembled the hieroglyphs I had seen in the temple, but they were unfamiliar, older, almost alive. A chill ran through me, though the sun beat down fiercely. It felt as if the stone was waiting, watching. The desert was full of such mysteries. Travelers spoke of lost tombs, sealed centuries ago, filled with treasures and curses. Some claimed that pharaohs hid gold and sacred texts in hidden chambers, and that only the worthy could find them. I did not know what it meant to be worthy, but I felt the pull of these secrets in my chest. The desert held a language older than speech, and I was determined to learn it. I remember walking for hours, feeling the sun burn my shoulders and the sand slip beneath my sandals. Shadows of dunes stretched long in the afternoon light, and the wind sang through the ridges like a soft, eerie melody. Occasionally, I would see a scarab beetle pushing a ball of sand across the ground, a small living echo of the eternal cycle of life and death. In the evenings, I returned to the village with my pockets full of odd stones and broken pottery. The elders always raised their eyebrows at my collections, but none scolded me. Perhaps they knew that curiosity, like the Nile, had its own current, unstoppable and necessary. Sometimes I would dream of the past, imagining lives that had once thrived where the sand now lay silent. A great caravan crossing the desert, men carrying scrolls filled with spells, a mother hiding her child from raiders beneath a cliff, priests performing rituals in moonlight, their voices mingling with the wind. These visions felt real, more vivid than anything I saw in daily life. It was during one of these walks that I discovered a small hidden shrine. Carved directly into the side of a low cliff, it was nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Inside were faint traces of paint, red and gold, depicting a man with the head of a falcon holding a staff. An offering of broken pottery and faded reeds lay at the foot. I knelt carefully, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on me. The shrine was silent, yet it seemed alive. I could almost hear whispers, faint and indistinct, like the rustle of leaves in the reeds. It spoke of devotion, of live sacrifice to gods whose names had been forgotten. I stayed there until the sun sank low, painting the desert in orange and purple. As I walked back, I carried the feeling with me, that the land, the sand, and the wind remembered everything, long after people had vanished. That night, I could not sleep. I lay under the stars, thinking of the shrine, the carved stone, and the endless dunes. The desert was not empty. It was alive with history, legends, and secrets waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. I realized then that life in Egypt was as much about the mysteries hidden beneath the surface as it was about the Nile, the temples, and the pyramids. The river gave life, the temples gave eternity, but the desert whispered truths that few dared to hear. The city was alive in a way the village never could be. When I first stepped onto the wide streets of Thebes, the scent of spices and baked bread hit me like a wave. I stumbled over uneven stones, trying to take it all in. Merchants shouted from stalls, their voices rising above the clamor, offering dates, figs, onions, flaxcloth, and jars of oil. The smell of roasted meat mingled with the sharp tang of copper from coin trays. Children ran between legs of busy adults, laughing and dodging goats tied to posts. Women in brightly dyed linen carried baskets balanced gracefully on their heads, their jewelry clinking softly with each step. Priests passed through the crowd, robes rustling and eyes fixed forward, as if the noise of the city could not touch them. I walked slowly, letting my eyes roam. A spice seller held up a small jar of cinnamon and ginger, exclaiming its worth from the distant lands of Punt. Across the way, a fisherman displayed a fresh catch, silver scales gleaming in the sunlight. A man sold amulets carved with falcons and scarabs, claiming they could protect against curses and evil spirits. I wondered how many people truly believed him, and how many simply wanted to hope. Amid the noise, I overheard rumors, whispered stories about the pharaoh and his court. Some said he was immortal, the son of Ra himself. Others whispered darker tales, plots, assassinations, the mysterious disappearances of men who dared speak against him. Even merchants, busy as they were, paused occasionally to listen and nod, their eyes reflecting fear and curiosity. I wandered closer to the temple district, where the air grew heavy with incense and solemn chants. The priests here seemed more distant, more powerful. They spoke in low voices to visitors, offering blessings or reading omens from the flight of birds and the shapes of entrails. People bowed, left gifts, and hurried away, careful not to anger these men who wielded unseen power. Among the crowd, I noticed scribes with their reed pens and ink jars. They moved swiftly, recording transactions, letters, and stories of the day. One young scribe paused, glanced at me, and smiled faintly before continuing his work. For a moment, I imagined learning to read and write, to record the life of Egypt not in fleeting speech but in symbols that could survive centuries. I stopped at a stall where a woman sold pottery painted with falcons and lotus flowers. She offered me a small cup, smiling. "For protection," she said. "Keep it by your bed, and the gods will watch over you." I nodded, accepting it, feeling the weight of her belief and the countless generations that had passed such practices down. Even in the chaos, there was rhythm. The city breathed in unison, merchants shouting, children laughing, animals bleating, priests chanting. Everything followed a pattern, as if the Nile itself flowed through the streets, carrying life, stories, and secrets to all corners of Egypt. As the sun climbed high, heat radiating from the stone streets, I found a quiet corner near a fountain. Water bubbled over carved stone, providing cool relief. From here, I could watch the market without being in the center of it. I saw traders argue over prices, mothers scold children, and travelers pass through, bringing news from distant lands. Everything seemed important, and yet nothing stopped. The life of the city moved relentlessly forward. That evening, as I returned to the riverbank, my head was full of voices, smells, and visions. The city had shown me another side of Egypt, a world of opportunity, ambition, and danger, intertwined with everyday life. I realized that the streets, like the Nile, carried stories, some whispered, some shouted, all alive. Sitting by the river, watching the water reflect the last rays of the sun, I understood that life in Egypt was more than survival. It was a constant rhythm of work, worship, trade, and intrigue, a story that stretched from the smallest village to the grandest city and beyond. Even in the distant corners of the marketplace, the shadow of the pharaoh was everywhere. No one saw him daily, yet everyone felt his presence. I had heard stories for years. Some whispered, others shouted. The pharaoh was not merely a king, he was a living god, the son of Ra himself. To speak ill of him could bring ruin, yet to speak in awe could bring favor. One day, as I lingered near a busy stall selling perfumed oils, a traveling merchant leaned close to me. His eyes darted around nervously, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "They say the pharaoh walks among us only at night, in disguise, to test his people," he said. "He can appear as a beggar, a soldier, even a simple scribe. Watch what you say, boy. The gods themselves might be listening." I shivered, half in fear, half in excitement. To think that a man so immense in power could walk unnoticed through the streets. I imagined him blending with the crowds, listening to gossip, judging hearts without anyone knowing. Later, I overheard women talking near a bread stall. One spoke of a palace feast where the pharaoh had demanded the rarest fish from the Nile, roasted to perfection, while another whispered that he had ordered the execution of a courtier who dared question his rule. Stories of wealth, cruelty, and mystery swirled together like incense smoke in a temple. I began to notice details in the city that others seemed to ignore. Soldiers in golden trim would appear suddenly, standing silently near market entrances, their eyes sharp and calculating. I wondered if they were there to watch the people, or if the pharaoh himself had sent them to see me. Perhaps even now, he was among us, observing, judging. One evening, an older man, a retired scribe, told me another story. He claimed that the pharaoh possessed secret chambers beneath the palace where he consulted with priests, read the stars, and spoke to gods. They say he knows the future, the scribe said, eyes wide. Not by chance, but because the gods whisper it to him. And those who know too much sometimes disappear. The sun had already begun its descent behind the desert cliffs as I walked home, my mind spinning with stories and fears. I imagined the pharaoh as a vast shadow stretching over the land, invisible yet commanding, his gaze hidden but never absent. The city felt alive in a new way. Every whispered rumor, every secret glance, every hurried step seemed connected to him. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my small home. I could hear the distant calls of priests chanting in the temples, the steady murmur of the Nile, and in my imagination, the silent tread of the pharaoh walking among the people. Perhaps he was testing their hearts, or perhaps he simply watched for his own amusement. I realized that life in Egypt was not just about survival or devotion. It was also about understanding the unseen forces that shaped every moment. The river gave us life, the temples gave us guidance, and the pharaoh, living god, hidden judge, shadow of power, demanded attention, even from those too small to see him clearly. From that night onward, I could not help but look differently at everything. At the merchants, at the priests, at soldiers in the streets, and at my own family. The pharaoh's presence, whispered in stories and rumors, was a reminder that even in a land bathed in sun and sustained by the Nile, power and mystery moved silently, shaping destinies like the river shaping the land. The scribes were a world apart, yet I found myself drawn to them as if by the river's current. They moved with a calm, deliberate grace, reed pens in hand, inkpots at their sides. Unlike the merchants shouting in the market or the priests chanting in the temples, the scribes' world was quiet, but every quiet breath seemed to carry weight. Every stroke of their pen seemed to shape the very soul of Egypt. I first watched them in the temple courtyard. A group of young scribes, barely older than I was, leaned over papyrus sheets while older men guided their hands. Their lessons were painstaking, each symbol traced carefully, corrected with a soft whisper. The older scribes spoke of the Mot, the cosmic order, and how every word recorded had to honor it. Mistakes were not just errors, they were offenses to truth itself. I approached cautiously, pretending to observe the courtyard as though I had business there. One scribe, a boy named Peta, noticed me. His dark eyes studied mine before he smiled faintly and nodded. "Curious, are you?" he asked. His voice was soft, almost secretive, like he feared someone might overhear. "Yes," I said. "I want to learn." He tilted his head. "It is not something for every boy. You must have patience. A reed pen does not forgive, and the ink remembers everything." Over the following weeks, I returned often. Peta allowed me to sit at the edge of the courtyard, watching the scribes form hieroglyphs with precision I could scarcely imagine. They recorded everything: offerings to the gods, the names of kings, the transactions of merchants, even events from villages like mine far along the Nile. Each word was carefully chosen, each symbol a bridge between the living and the eternal. One day, Peta handed me a small piece of papyrus and a brush. "Try," he said. My hands trembled as I traced the first symbol, a simple line, yet it felt heavier than the largest stone I had lifted at the pyramids. The ink bled slightly, a tiny imperfection, and my heart sank. "Patience," he whispered. "Even the greatest scribes begin with one stroke. Remember, writing is not just recording. It is preserving the soul of the world." I practiced daily, often alone by the river, trying to mimic the elegance of their strokes. Each symbol I traced seemed to connect me to centuries before me, to scribes in temples long vanished, to priests writing under flickering torchlight, to kings who had demanded records of their conquests. I began to understand the power of words, how they could honor the gods, preserve truth, and even shape the destiny of a nation. Through the scribes, I also learned secrets of Egypt that few ever spoke aloud. Certain texts were forbidden to the uninitiated, scrolls filled with rituals omens, and instructions to communicate with the gods. Peta hinted at their existence but never showed me, only whispered that one day, if I proved myself, I might glimpse them. I began to see the hierarchy of knowledge. Priests could interpret the will of the gods, scribes could record and transmit it, and the pharaoh commanded both. Everyone else, farmers, merchants, children like me, relied on this hidden order without fully understanding it. It was invisible, like the Nile beneath the sand, yet it shaped everything. By night, as I lay under the stars, I practiced tracing symbols in the sand with a stick, my fingers smudged with dust. I imagined them glowing in torchlight, carved into papyrus that would survive centuries. Somewhere in the distant future, perhaps someone would see these marks and understand the life of our time. And I realized, with a thrill I could not fully name, that I wanted more than to watch. I wanted to learn. I wanted to touch the hidden currents of Egypt's power, to see the words that shaped temples, temples that housed gods, gods that guided kings. The path would not be easy. The ink demanded patience, the symbols demanded respect, but I felt, deep in my bones, that my life was beginning to flow toward this knowledge, just as the Nile flowed toward the sea. The temple was quiet when I first entered its inner halls. The sun had barely risen, spilling a pale light through narrow windows, and the air was thick with the scent of incense, beeswax, and old stone. I followed Peta and a small group of scribes as they passed under carved lintels, their footsteps echoing softly. This was no longer the marketplace or even the outer courtyard. Here, every sound seemed magnified, and every shadow carried meaning. An older priest, tall and stern, awaited us. His linen robe was spotless, and his shaved head gleamed in the sunlight. He carried a staff carved with the shape of a falcon, and his eyes, dark and sharp, seemed to pierce not just outward but inward, reading thoughts, intentions, and perhaps even souls. "You wish to learn," he said, his voice steady, carrying authority without anger. "Then observe, and do not speak unless spoken to. The temple does not welcome haste, nor the curious who lack patience." We were led into a hall lined with statues of gods and pharaohs. Each figure seemed alive, their eyes reflecting flickers of torchlight. The priest explained that every gesture, every chant, every offering was a channel through which the divine could touch the mortal world. I felt the weight of it immediately. It was not just ritual, it was a bridge to eternity. Peta guided me to a small alcove, where I could watch the older scribes record sacred texts. Their hands moved with deliberate precision, each stroke carrying intent and reverence. They copied hymns, incantations, and lists of offerings, all while murmuring softly under their breath. The sound was like a low river flowing through the hall, steady, constant, alive. The priest approached, and I bowed instinctively. He nodded and motioned for me to follow. "Today, you will participate," he said, "not as a master, but as a witness who begins to understand. Watch closely and feel the rhythm." We moved to the central chamber, where the golden statue of Ammoniusare rose in quiet splendor. Flames from oil lamps flickered across its polished surface, casting shadows that danced along the hieroglyph-covered walls. The priest began the morning chant, his deep voice resonating in waves. The scribes joined, softer but in perfect harmony, creating a current of sound that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself. I mimicked their posture, careful to bow and raise my hands as instructed. My voice was timid at first, nearly swallowed by the richness of the others, but gradually, as the chant repeated, I found my rhythm. I felt it then, the pulse of something vast and old, a presence that was not human yet moved through human hearts. The air was heavy, thick with incense, and I felt as though I could reach out and touch eternity itself. After the chant, the priest spoke softly to me. "You felt it, did you not? The power of what is beyond? The gods are not distant. They are here, in every word, every gesture, every flame. Respect them, learn their language, and you may begin to serve not just the temple, but the world itself. The rest of the day was filled with smaller lessons: how to prepare offerings, the meaning behind each symbol, the importance of timing, and the rhythm of prayers. Every motion, no matter how small, had significance. Even spilling a drop of oil or misplacing a glyph could disrupt the balance between mortal and divine. That evening, I walked back to the river under the orange glow of the setting sun. The lessons clung to me like the heat of the day, heavy, powerful, and impossible to ignore. I felt smaller, yet somehow taller, as if the temple had lifted a piece of me toward the stars. The world outside seemed quieter now. The market, the streets, even my village felt like echoes compared to the living, breathing presence of the temple. I understood then that life in Egypt was a tapestry of layers. The river, the pyramids, the city, the scribes, and the temple, all connected, all flowing together like the Nile itself. And somewhere deep in the quiet of my mind, I felt the pull of something I could not yet name, a destiny entwined with gods, kings, and the eternal rhythms of Egypt. Beyond the temples, beyond the bustling city streets and the calm of the Nile, lay another world entirely: the tombs. I had heard stories of them all my life: hidden chambers carved into cliffs, walls painted with scenes of gods, kings, and the journeys of souls to the afterlife. Some whispered of curses, others of treasures that no mortal hand could count. And now, for the first time, I would see them up close. Peta led me through a narrow passage in the cliffs, where the wind carried the faint, dry scent of stone dust. The sun had not yet reached the opening, and the shadows inside seemed alive, shifting and stretching as we walked. Craftsmen were already at work, chiseling smooth walls, carving intricate reliefs, and polishing surfaces until they gleamed faintly in the torchlight. The sound of hammers and chisels echoed off the stone, creating a rhythm both harsh and mesmerizing. I watched as a master artist painted the walls. Each stroke told a story: the pharaoh in his golden boat sailing across the sky, Osiris judging souls in the afterlife, Anubis guiding the dead through the underworld. The colors were vibrant: deep blues, rich reds, golden yellows, even in the dim light. I realized that the walls were more than decoration. They were maps, prayers, and warnings all at once. "Every symbol has power," whispered Peta. "Every image is a spell. They protect the dead, guide them, and sometimes they even warn the living." Some of the workers spoke quietly of tomb curses. They said that those who disturbed a tomb without respect would suffer misfortune, or worse, that the spirits of the dead would follow them for life. Others scoffed, claiming it was only superstition to scare children and lazy workers. I did not know what to believe, but the weight of the stone and the silence of the chambers made me feel a strange reverence and a flicker of fear. We descended deeper into the tombs, where the air grew cooler and heavy with the smell of earth and incense left by past generations. Here I saw the preparations for a burial: intricately carved sarcophagi, chests of jewelry, jars filled with oils, perfumes, and even food offerings meant for the journey beyond. Everything was meticulous, planned to last for eternity. The Egyptians believed death was not an end but a continuation, a voyage that required guidance, protection, and respect. An elder craftsman noticed my wide eyes and smiled faintly. "You see, boy," he said, "the tomb is more than stone. It is a bridge. The pharaoh may leave this world, but his soul must continue. These walls, these images, these spells, they hold him steady while he crosses into eternity." As I traced the carved hieroglyphs with my fingers, I felt a strange sensation. The walls seemed almost to hum, as if alive with memory. Every symbol carried centuries of devotion, fear, and hope. I understood then that these tombs were not just for kings. They were for all who wanted to leave a mark, to connect life with the unseen, to challenge the forgetfulness of time itself. By the time we emerged, the sun had dipped low, painting the desert in gold and purple. I stood at the entrance, watching the shadows stretch across the sand. Behind me lay the tombs, silent yet pulsing with invisible life. Ahead, the Nile flowed calmly, carrying the living and the stories of the dead alike. I realized that life in Egypt was a delicate balance: creation and destruction, work and worship, the living and the departed. Everything was connected, woven together like a single immense tapestry, each thread carrying memory and meaning. And somewhere in the quiet, I felt the pull of those hidden forces, urging me to understand more, to see further, to touch the mysteries that lay beyond the walls of my world. The desert whispered its secrets, the tombs held their silence, and I knew that my journey through Egypt's hidden and sacred worlds had only just begun. The first time I witnessed the Festival of the Dead, I felt as though the entire world had shifted. It was a night unlike any other, when the living and the dead seemed to walk side by side. Families brought offerings to the river, carrying baskets of bread, jars of wine, and bowls of fragrant herbs. The city streets glowed with lamps, and torches flickered against the stone walls, casting dancing shadows that made the night feel alive. I followed Peta and a group of scribes to a small plaza near the temple. There, priests had arranged an altar adorned with statues of Osiris, Anubis, and other gods of the underworld. Flowers, incense, and carved figurines filled every available surface. The air was heavy with the scent of myrrh and lotus, and the murmur of prayers mingled with the distant flow of the Nile. The festival began with a procession. People carried effigies of their ancestors, masks painted with careful detail, robes fluttering as they walked. Children followed, their small voices rising in songs meant to honor those who had passed. I watched as offerings were placed on stone platforms, tiny gifts meant to nourish the spirits in their journey through the afterlife. The priests chanted in low rhythmic tones, their voices weaving a tapestry of sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air. I felt the chant in my chest, a deep resonant pulse that connected every person, every flame, and every shadow in the plaza. It was as if the walls themselves remembered these rituals, repeating them faithfully across generations. Peta leaned close. "We honor the dead," he whispered, "so they may watch over us. We feed them in the world beyond, and they guide us in this world. Without this connection, life and death become chaos." I looked at the faces around me, men, women, children, all caught in the same rhythm. I realized that for the Egyptians, death was not something to fear. It was part of a continuum, an extension of life that demanded respect, care, and remembrance. The living had a duty to sustain the dead, just as the dead, in turn, sustained the living through guidance and memory. The night deepened, and the stars glittered like scattered gems across the desert sky. From the riverbank, I saw small boats with flickering lamps drift on the Nile, each carrying offerings and prayers to distant tombs. The water reflected the light, creating a path that seemed to stretch from the living world to the realm of the gods. I felt a shiver, not of fear but of awe. The festival was a bridge between worlds, a reminder that every action, every prayer, every symbol mattered beyond the confines of life. Priests began to tell stories aloud, recounting the deeds of great ancestors, heroic pharaohs, and even humble farmers who had lived with honor. The people listened silently, captivated by tales that blended history, myth, and divine instruction. Sometimes I imagined that the spirits themselves were listening, walking among the crowd, approving gestures, whispering secrets to those who had eyes to see. By the end of the night, the plaza was quiet again. Only the flicker of dying torches and the gentle lap of the Nile remained. I stood at the river's edge, holding a small offering I had carried, a loaf of bread, simple and fragrant, and I whispered a silent prayer, feeling the presence of those who had walked the earth long before me. It was in that moment I understood that Egypt was not merely a land of monuments and priests, scribes and kings. It was a living continuum, a delicate balance where the past, present, and future intertwined. The river, the tombs, the temples, and the festivals all served the same purpose: to connect life and death, mortal and divine, so that nothing, not even time itself, could ever be truly lost. I returned home that night with a sense of wonder and quiet resolve. Life in Egypt demanded awareness, reverence, and participation. It was a world alive with unseen threads, guiding and shaping every heartbeat, every action, every choice. And for the first time, I felt that I was beginning to understand how to follow them. The priests moved like shadows within the temple, their robes whispering against the stone floors, their eyes calm yet sharp, always observing. I had already seen them guide rituals, chant in rhythm, and instruct scribes, but there was a depth beneath their actions that few outside the temple walls could sense. That depth was knowledge, ancient, guarded, and powerful. Peta led me to a small, hidden courtyard where the air felt cooler, as if the stone itself protected the space from the sun. Here, older priests gathered, speaking quietly in tones too soft for ordinary ears. I realized that these conversations were not mere instructions or daily planning. They were discussions of prophecy, interpretation of omens, and the intricate politics of Egypt. One priest noticed me lingering and beckoned. "You wish to learn," he said softly, a hint of curiosity in his voice. "But know this, the knowledge you seek is not for idle hearts. The gods themselves demand patience, discretion, and respect." I nodded, swallowing my nervousness. He handed me a small scroll with cryptic symbols, instructing me to copy them carefully. "Observe the lines, the spacing, the curves," he said. "Even a single stroke carries meaning. This is not writing for the world. This is writing for the unseen." As I traced the symbols with my reed pen, I began to understand. These writings were not simply records. They were instructions, prayers, and connections. They could summon protection, guide the pharaoh's decisions, and preserve the balance between gods and men. Each word, each symbol, was part of a larger current of power, invisible but undeniable. Beyond the scrolls, I began noticing subtle behaviors. Priests spoke in glances, used gestures that seemed meaningless to outsiders, and exchanged small tokens that conveyed entire instructions. They held sway over the city, the river, and even the pharaoh himself, though their power was often invisible to the common people. Some merchants paid tribute not to kings but to priests, seeking protection, favors, or secret knowledge. Late one night, I followed Peta and a few priests through a narrow passage leading beneath the temple. Torchlight revealed hidden chambers, filled with rare manuscripts, jars of herbs, and objects that radiated significance I could not yet name. The priests whispered as they moved, their voices carrying reverence and authority. They demonstrated rituals meant to interpret dreams, predict the rise and fall of the Nile, and even foresee political unrest. One elder priest, noticing my awe, spoke gently. "The gods have entrusted us with their knowledge," he said. "Through these texts and rituals, we guide, we protect, and we advise. But remember, knowledge without wisdom can destroy as surely as ignorance can. You are learning not just to see, but to understand." I felt a chill, not from the cool air of the chamber, but from the realization that life in Egypt was not only sustained by the river or the work of scribes and farmers. It was shaped by those who could interpret the unseen, who could bridge the mortal and divine, and who knew the secrets of power hidden from common eyes. By dawn, as the first light spilled across the temple stones, I walked home with my heart pounding. I realized that the priests were not merely servants of gods, they were the invisible architects of Egypt's destiny. And somewhere in the careful rhythm of their words, gestures, and scrolls, I felt the stirrings of a path that might one day allow me to understand, and perhaps even wield, a fraction of their hidden power. The Nile flowed quietly beside me, carrying life and stories as always, but now I saw the currents beneath, strong, unseen, and guiding everything in ways most could never imagine. I knew, with both excitement and caution, that my journey into Egypt's hidden truths had only just begun. Over the next weeks, my lessons with the scribes grew more intense. Peta guided me deeper into the subtle art of writing, showing me that hieroglyphs were far more than mere pictures. Each symbol carried layers of meaning, context, and intention, like threads in a tapestry that wove together the world of gods, pharaohs, and mortals. One morning, Peta led me to a secluded chamber filled with manuscripts I had never seen. The walls were lined with scrolls of varying sizes, some so fragile that even touching them lightly might crumble them into dust. "These are not for everyday use," he whispered. "These contain truths that can change lives, destinies even. Some knowledge is dangerous if misread, or used without understanding." I picked up a small scroll, its edges worn and ink faded, and carefully unrolled it. The symbols seemed familiar yet different, not the simple records of offerings or transactions I had practiced, but complex arrangements, intertwined with prayers, omens, and instructions for interpreting signs. I felt a thrill of fear and fascination. To think that a single word could alter fate was almost unimaginable. Peta watched me closely. "To understand these texts, you must learn patience and perception," he said. "Do not rush. Do not assume meaning from the surface. Listen to the space between symbols. Let your mind feel what your eyes cannot yet see." I began spending hours tracing the lines, murmuring the associated chants under my breath. Gradually, I started noticing patterns, repetitions that emphasized power, sequences that suggested caution, combinations of symbols that indicated protection or danger. It was as if the text spoke to me, revealing secrets slowly, cautiously, almost reluctantly. Through this work, I realized the scribe's power was subtle but profound. Those who could interpret and write wisely shaped how history was recorded, how decisions were made, and even how people understood the divine. A king might issue a decree, but the scribe gave it clarity, permanence, and sometimes a hidden nuance that could influence outcomes far beyond the palace walls. Peta shared stories of legendary scribes whose work had changed kingdoms. One had preserved a famine warning that saved hundreds of lives. Another had recorded the rise of a hidden rebellion, allowing the pharaoh to respond before disaster struck. I began to understand that writing was not passive. It was an act of creation and foresight, a responsibility heavier than any physical labor in the fields. One night, alone in the chamber, I attempted to copy a complex ritual text. The symbols intertwined like vines, and I struggled to maintain their balance and proportion. Frustrated, I almost abandoned it, but then I paused and breathed slowly, letting the rhythm of the pen match the rhythm of my heartbeat. Slowly, the symbols began to flow as one, and I felt a connection, a quiet whisper from the past, as if the scribe who first wrote this text were guiding my hand. That moment changed everything. I realized that life in Egypt was layered with invisible currents. The river gave sustenance, the temples offered guidance, the pharaoh wielded authority, and the scribes captured, preserved, and subtly directed the course of all. To read and write well was not merely skill, it was participation in the unseen fabric that bound gods and men together. I left the chamber that night feeling both humbled and exhilarated. The moon reflected on the Nile's surface, silver and gentle, and I thought of the scrolls I had touched. They carried whispers of power, caution, and eternity. I understood then that every stroke of ink, every carefully formed symbol, was a step closer to understanding the hidden heartbeat of Egypt itself. And deep inside, I felt the pull of the path ahead, a path that would lead me into ever more secret chambers, ancient wisdom, and the silent, formidable power that shaped all of life along the Nile. The first time I approached the great construction site outside the city, I felt as though I had stepped into another world entirely. The air was filled with the sound of chisels striking stone, hammers pounding wooden mallets, and the occasional shout of foremen coordinating labor. Dust rose in golden clouds, drifting over rows of workers hauling limestone blocks, shaping them, and fitting them into massive structures that seemed impossible for mere men to raise. I watched in awe as master builders directed their crews. Their gestures were precise, almost like a language of the body, and every movement carried purpose. Each block of stone was not merely heavy, it carried weight in history, in ritual, and in eternity. Some were carved with symbols meant to honor the gods. Others were designed to align perfectly with the stars, the sun, or the river, an engineering feat that combined science, art, and devotion. Peta had arranged for me to observe from a small platform nearby, and I could see the hierarchy of labor. Skilled masons measured angles and smoothened surfaces, while others moved blocks along wooden sleds lubricated with water and clay to reduce friction. The coordination required was staggering, and I realized that every block was placed with both physical precision and spiritual intention. One of the elder builders noticed my wide-eyed gaze. He crouched beside me and explained, "These stones are more than stone. They are vessels. They carry prayers, intentions, and the weight of kings into eternity. We honor the gods with each placement, for the alignment is not only for the living to see, but for the gods to witness." I watched as workers carved hieroglyphs into the walls of a new pyramid chamber. Each symbol was deliberate, filled with meaning, and designed to endure the sands of time. The inscriptions told stories of kings, gods, offerings, and even warnings to intruders who might dare to disturb the tombs. I realized that the builders were not merely constructing monuments. They were weaving a language of stone that would communicate with the world for centuries. The heat of the day was relentless, and yet there was a rhythm to the work that was almost meditative. Workers sang in low voices, chants that kept the labor synchronized and infused with energy. I followed the patterns, counting blocks, noting measurements, and feeling the pulse of a civilization dedicated to leaving its mark on eternity. As the sun began to set, painting the stones with warm amber light, I noticed something extraordinary. Certain stones were aligned not just for structural support, but to catch the sunlight at precise angles during solstices. Others seemed to be positioned according to hidden geometry, an understanding of the heavens that few in the city possessed. The builders whispered that only those chosen by the pharaoh and the priests knew the full plan. A plan meant to honor gods, measure time, and preserve memory. That evening, I returned to the river, my body weary but my mind alive with wonder. I realized that life in Egypt was shaped not only by scribes, priests, and pharaohs, but also by hands that molded stone, lifted immense burdens, and orchestrated labor with artistry and devotion. Every monument, every pyramid, every carved stone was a testament to the knowledge, patience, and spiritual depth of a people who sought to touch eternity. As I lay on the riverbank that night, the sound of the water mingling with distant hammering, I felt a new understanding taking root. Life in Egypt was an intricate dance of labor, devotion, and unseen design. And somewhere, in the careful alignment of stones and the whispered chants of the builders, I sensed the eternal heartbeat of a civilization that had mastered both earth and sky. The Nile was the lifeblood of our world, and I spent hours along its banks, watching, listening, and learning. Boats floated gracefully on its surface, some carrying merchants with goods from distant lands, others fishermen casting nets and lines into the water, their movements precise and practiced. The river was alive with color, sound, and stories, a flowing stage for the daily dramas of life in Egypt. I met boatmen who spoke in hushed tones of strange sightings in the river, glowing fish that appeared only at night, crocodiles that seemed to understand warnings, and currents that shifted as if the river itself were aware of those who sailed upon it. Some of the older fishermen claimed that the Nile whispered secrets to those who listened carefully, that it remembered the deeds of kings, priests, and even common folk, and sometimes revealed these memories to those patient enough to notice. Merchants brought news from far-off cities, grains, spices, rare stones, and even tales of kings in distant lands. They told of caravans attacked by bandits, of deserts where travelers vanished, and of temples so magnificent that even the gods seemed to linger there. Every story carried a hint of caution, a lesson, or a secret that could change one's understanding of the world. I began to notice patterns in the people who lived along the river. Fishermen rose before dawn, singing low chants to bless their nets. Traders followed a strict rhythm in their sails, speaking carefully chosen words that could charm buyers or conceal hidden truths. Children played along the banks, yet even they seemed to respect the river's power, tossing stones lightly, never disturbing the water's sacred flow. One evening, an old fisherman invited me to sit by his fire. He had deep lines etched into his face, and his eyes held a quiet knowledge that made me uneasy and fascinated at once. "The river is alive," he said softly, tossing a small stick into the fire. "It gives life, but it takes notice. Men think they control it, but it remembers. And it sometimes punishes. Not always with death, but with lessons. Lessons you cannot ignore." As he spoke, I noticed the firelight reflecting off the Nile, turning the water into molten gold. Shadows danced across the surface, and I imagined the river carrying all the stories, secrets, and whispers of generations, a living archive of Egypt itself. It dawned on me that the scribes recorded life on papyrus, the priests captured it in ritual, and the builders immortalized it in stone, but the river carried it naturally, flowing with a memory older than any human hand could preserve. That night, I walked along the riverbank, letting my feet sink into the wet sand. I imagined the countless boats that had passed this way, the merchants and fishermen who had laughed, argued, and dreamed along its shores. Somewhere in the gentle lapping of water, I thought I heard fragments of ancient conversations, perhaps even warnings and advice from those long gone. Life along the Nile was more than survival. It was a living network of stories, lessons, and mysteries. Every fish, every ripple, every whisper of wind carried meaning. I understood then that Egypt was not merely a land of stone and sand, pyramids and temples, but a living, breathing entity, where every person, animal, and element contributed to its eternal story. And I realized something else, that my journey, following rivers of knowledge, stone, and devotion, was becoming inseparable from the river itself. I was learning not just to see, but to listen, to feel, and perhaps in time, to understand the currents that guided the lives of kings and commoners alike. The day of the Festival of the Sun arrived like no other. From the first light of dawn, the city was alive with a rhythm I had never experienced before. Streets thrummed with the movement of priests, dancers, musicians, and citizens, all preparing to honor Ra, the sun god who sailed across the sky each day. I could feel the anticipation in the air, a mixture of excitement, devotion, and reverence that seemed to pulse in every heartbeat along the Nile. Peta guided me through the crowd, past merchants selling fragrant oils, brightly colored fabrics, and small statuettes of deities. Drums echoed from the temples, flutes sang, and chants rose and fell like waves, carrying messages not just to ears but to something deeper, almost to the soul itself. Even the children seemed swept into the rhythm, clapping, dancing, and imitating the gestures of priests with innocent enthusiasm. At the central plaza, an enormous golden statue of Ra glimmered in the morning sun. The priests had adorned it with garlands of flowers and offerings of bread, wine, and fruit. I watched as they performed the initial rituals, raising their arms, bowing in precise sequences, and chanting in low, harmonious tones. Each motion, each word, seemed to channel light itself, as if the energy of the sun could be captured and directed through their devotion. The people followed in procession, carrying torches and small shrines, moving slowly toward the river where larger ceremonies would take place. I noticed subtle gestures, the way some participants touched their hearts, others the ground, as though each action maintained a delicate balance between human and divine. Peta whispered that these small acts were as important as the grand gestures. The gods noticed both. As the sun climbed higher, the grand parade began. Dancers in gold and crimson moved in synchronized patterns, their costumes catching the light, creating the illusion of flames dancing upon the earth. Musicians played rhythms that seemed to make the very ground vibrate, and priests raised banners inscribed with sacred symbols, their fabric shimmering like liquid sunlight. I followed the procession to the riverbank, where boats had been prepared for the ceremony. The largest carried a gilded bark of RA, adorned with intricate carvings and glowing in the sun. Men rowed in unison, their oars slicing through the water with rhythmic precision. Offerings were cast into the river to honor the sun's journey, prayers were sung to guide its path, and incense smoke spiraled upward, carrying messages to the heavens. I stood there awestruck, realizing that life in Egypt was inseparable from devotion. The river, the temples, the monuments, and the sun itself were not merely background to existence. They were partners in a grand ritual that shaped every day, every season, every life. The festival of the sun made this connection vivid and tangible, a living testament to the belief that humanity and divinity were eternally intertwined. When the ceremonies ended, and the boats drifted back to shore, the city remained humming with the afterglow of energy and light. I walked home with Petter in silence, each of us feeling the lingering pulse of devotion, the quiet thrill of participating in something vast, eternal, and profoundly beautiful. I understood more deeply than ever that to live in Egypt was to live in harmony with these rhythms, to feel the pulse of the sun, river, and stone, and to recognize that every action, no matter how small, resonated in the unseen fabric of the world. The desert stretched before me like a sea of gold and ochre, its vastness both awe-inspiring and humbling. I had crossed the boundaries of the city, the river, and the temples, and now I found myself alone among dunes that shifted endlessly, sculpted by winds older than any living memory. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows that danced across the sand, and even the air felt charged, as though the desert itself were aware of every footstep I took. Petta did not accompany me this time. He said I needed to see this world for myself, to hear its whispers and learn its secrets without guidance. I walked slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the vast horizon, noticing patterns in the sand, distant rocks, and occasional clusters of hardy shrubs. Here, life seemed minimal, yet every movement, every sound, carried significance. Even the wind seemed to speak, shifting dunes and whispering through rocks, as if the desert had its own voice and its own stories to tell. I met a caravan of nomadic traders along a rocky path. Their camels moved gracefully, carrying goods and water, and the leaders greeted me with quiet respect. Around their campfires at night, they told stories of lost cities buried beneath the sands, of treasures hidden in abandoned temples, and of spirits that wandered the dunes under the moonlight. Some spoke of massive stone statues swallowed by sandstorms, of pharaohs' long-forgotten treasures, and of mysterious creatures that roamed the desert at night, watching travelers from afar. One elder nomad pointed to the horizon. "Do you see that ridge?" he said. "Beneath it lies a city older than memory. Some say the gods built it and left signs in stone. Others say only the brave, or the foolish, find it. The desert tests all who enter. It gives and it takes. You must listen, or you will be lost." That night, I camped under a blanket of stars so vast it seemed infinite. The desert was silent except for the whispering wind and the occasional distant howl of a fox. I felt small, a single spark against eternity, yet profoundly connected. The sand carried memories of ancient kings, wandering merchants, forgotten rituals, and even the gods themselves. I imagined the Nile stretching into this barren world centuries ago, bringing life and stories, only for them to be claimed again by the endless desert. I walked among the dunes at dawn, tracing patterns in the sand left by wind, animals, and perhaps even travelers long past. Somewhere in the subtle curves, I thought I glimpsed the ghosts of lost cities, walls half buried, columns toppled, inscriptions faded but still whispering. I realized that the desert was not empty. It was alive with memory, patience, and hidden power. Each grain of sand seemed to hold a fragment of history, and every step I took stirred echoes of the past. Life in Egypt, I understood then, was not confined to the fertile riverbanks or the stone monuments. The desert, too, was alive, shaping stories, legends, and fears. It reminded me that history was not only what was recorded or built, but also what was hidden, lost, and waiting to be discovered. Its silence carried lessons, its storms demanded respect, and its vastness made every human effort, whether building temples, writing scrolls, or raising pyramids, both miraculous and fleeting. As I returned to the city, I carried with me the hum of the desert, its whispered stories and hidden knowledge. I realized that Egypt was more than a land of stone and water. It was a living network of rivers, sands, temples, tombs, and skies, each part teaching, guiding, and warning those who took the time to observe. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that my journey was far from over, that the desert had shown me only a fragment of the mysteries yet to unfold.